Hi everyone, Sickthany Beat Tano here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of the new Mount Eerie record, Sauna. Mount Eerie is currently the main musical pseudonym of multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter, and producer Phil Elverum. And for years, he released some of my favorite music of all time under the name The Microphones. He later transitioned to the Mount Eerie name with a pretty minimal sound change, still dabbling in lo-fi, experimental, noisy, avant-garde, and abstract folk music, with a lot of lyrics focused on mortality, existence, the natural world at large. And even though I've always considered Phil's sound to be pretty progressive and unique, idiosyncratic, there's always been something kind of amateurish and sloppy and a little innocent about his performances and his recordings. And while I do think he has a really defined style, his albums usually are kind of cluttered, unpredictable, due to just how esoteric and abstract and harsh the sound of a Mount Eerie album can be. And after Phil transitioned to the Mount Eerie name, he continued to come out with music that I liked quite a bit. The very sparse and acoustic Dawn album, as well as the Lost Wisdom collection of tracks with Julie Doran of Eric's Trip, really beautiful set of songs on this record. Also the black metal inspired Wind's Poem, and there was a collection of tracks influenced by metalcore and hardcore punk on the Black Wooden Ceiling opening EP that I liked a lot. However, with his latest string of releases, Clear Moon, for example, Phil was delivering much dronier, much more ambient tracks. The album wasn't too bad, but the record he followed it up with very immediately, Ocean Roar, just kind of felt like a series of afterthoughts that were maybe a little uninspired. So even though these last few records haven't really been my favorites in the Phil Elverum discography, I still went into Sauna expecting good things, considering that Mount Eerie always tries to do something at least a little different with each project. But I don't really think that's the case this time around. I think this new album here is maybe even more drone-ridden than its predecessor. I think the sounds, for the most part, are kind of warm, laid back, relaxing, especially when it comes to the opening, the title track on this LP, which is one of two tracks in the track listing here that are over 10 minutes, and they make up a good chunk of this album's 56-minute runtime. And this opening track actually mimics the feel of a sauna quite nicely. There are these warm, constant, droning keys, cymbals that sound like the sizzle of water hitting the really hot stones. And these drones are sort of punctuated very lightly with Phil's singing and lyrics, as well as some very bird-like, nice and pretty female vocal harmonies. It's not a pinnacle of great songwriting in the Mount Eerie discography, but it is still a very blissful, pleasant moment on the album that I think sets the tone of the record pretty well. But I'm not finding the tracks that follow immediately after this song to be nearly as inspired or interesting. The very brief song kind of feels like the beginning of one of my favorite tracks from The Glow Part 2, except with an electric guitar and just not as developed in terms of chord progression. It's like the beginning of one of my favorite tracks, but it just doesn't move beyond that initial point. The only thing I really find interesting about this track is Phil's very solitary poetry, referencing morning light and feeling disoriented after being awakened. And the words that Phil uses sort of gives me this impression that the days are sort of melting together for him, and there's like this thaw going on outside. The seasons are changing. It's almost as if he's woken up from some kind of hibernation. And then after that, there's the song Dragon, which I've heard a solo version of before, and this version is kind of revised with the bird-like vocal harmonies that appeared on the opening track here. And it seems pretty nice until the point where these roaring gusts of either wind or maybe like a field recording of a jet flying very low, but in the distance kind of just whatever this sound is, it just overtakes the song itself to the point where it's nearly unlistenable. And even though this sound may seem really important to Phil, I'm just not really sure it enhances the listening experience of the song. It just really kind of distracts from it. The song Emptiness was a kind of interesting change of pace. There was this really determined bass line on this track. Sounded like a synth bass line that would have made it into the background of a zombie record or something like that. But then the droning keys come in, thicken the song up, and it just sort of sounds like a variant of a moment from Clear Moon. Between these keys and the kind of dramatic drumming, the sound is pretty heavy, but Phil's really gentle vocals and melodies don't really penetrate for me. I feel the same way about the song Pumpkin to an extent too, even though I do like the more skeletal and poetic moments of this song. But as soon as the track gets heavier, I just feel myself losing touch with what's going on. And as if this album needed more similarities with Clear Moon, we get another interlude track on here just titled Something. And it's just a bunch of plinky keyboard filler. The song Books just kind of feels like another interlude as well, but with plucked strings playing for much of the duration of the track, except for the song's very final moments where all of a sudden it just feels like the track cuts out entirely and a new song is introduced with guitar, and poetically Phil delivers like this ode to books, which is actually pretty intriguing, but even that moment just fades out completely very suddenly. Much of this record breezes by me, and the spots that actually catch my ear and sound interesting are just so incredibly brief. The song Planets is maybe the first moment on this record where the songwriting actually stunned me. I thought the twangy reverb guitar leads on this track were actually pretty haunting and beautiful, and the lyrics talking about how when I die, the planet dies along with me. It just kind of feels like either Phil is talking from the standpoint of something much larger, like a planet, or maybe like a solar system or something like that, or maybe he's just talking about his perception as a human. When you die, everything else that you've ever known might as well be dead because it no longer exists to you. And for the rest of this record, there actually isn't another moment I find to be as poignant or beautiful. And while 3 and 5 minutes are perfectly fine lengths for songs, the average size cuts on this record just feel really fleeting and minor, more than usual for Phil, because he has a bit of a reputation for ending songs really abruptly, but at least not before they captivate. For me, a lot of the tracks here either don't do that at all, or at the very moment they do that, they just fly away. As for the other lengthy track on here, Spring, I actually dig this song a lot too. The ascending, layered guitar leads on this track, coupled with the vocal harmonies, it's actually very beautiful, a lot like the opening track here, but I really do get the feeling of spring coming on, transitioning from those colder months to those warmer months. These two lengthier tracks alone make the album worth checking out, and if Phil were to make a record that kind of centered around songs of these lengths, that could be interesting. Aside from this track, I really like the song Youth. I think the heavy, explosive, and climactic guitars on this track actually make this song a really fitting closer, which is kind of interesting given the album didn't really give much attention to flow, at least from what I could tell. In my experience, Phil is usually pretty anti-traditional flow. He'll throw some of the weirdest, most abstract, and some of the longest tracks right at the beginning of the record to throw people off. Overall, I think this album is all right. I like a lot of the poetry. I like the monstrous drone tracks. There are a few moments where I think Phil employs some newer or just different ideas, like the vocals and woodwinds on the second to last track on here, as well as the very heavy bassy synths on the closing track that are just hard hitting. I think he works this into his usual instrumental palette really nicely without throwing the whole record off. But beyond the sound, at the core of these tracks, when we're talking about melody and just the way the instrumentation is composed and arranged, I think this is one of Mount Eerie's most unmemorable and unremarkable projects in a while. Phil's usual ragtag aesthetic seems to be emphasized to the point where it's no longer endearing, and instead it's actually hindering these tracks and just making them feel, well, maybe a little unfinished, a little too unfinished. I'm feeling a light to decent 6 on this thing. Transition. If you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Mount Eerie, Sauna, forever.